Redeemer exists to help connect Jesus to people, people to community, and community to mission. Welcome to another Bible Talk in the Redeemer Queens Park community. So glad that you're here today. Listen, here's the big idea. God is a cosmic killjoy who doesn't want anyone to have fun, and all he wants to do is to weigh people down in bondage. That's the big idea for people who misunderstand one of the most important and beautiful parts of the whole Bible, the Ten Commandments. That's what we're into today. Exodus chapter 20, verses 1 to 21 is our course of study. I'm really looking forward to getting into it with you because the Ten Commandments are one of the most misunderstood parts of the entire Bible. But when rightly understood, they reveal to us the very heart of God. We get to see who God is, what God is like, and what God wants. And miraculously, the Ten Commandments actually give us a right picture of our own hearts as well. They function like an MRI scan of sorts to kind of get down inside, past the other stuff, and show us what's really there. The Ten Commandments. That's what we're talking about today in the Redeemer Queens Park community. Exodus chapter 20 is where it's at. And I just have for you 3 good comforts about the Ten Commandments. And when we think about the Ten Commandments, the first thing we see is that God is the King who's bringing a new type of kingdom. That's part of what the Ten Commandments teach us. Let's think of the Ten Commandments as a constitution. These 10 words or these 10 commands from God as this new constitution that God as King is lovingly giving to his people. Now, there's all kinds of other laws and rules that aren't the Constitution, but they are indeed God's law. We could think of these different types of laws as more of like federal legislation off to the side. We could think of these things as civil and ceremonial rules that should be followed and adhered to and obeyed to. But nothing comes close to the Constitution itself. These 10 words, these 10 commands, they reveal to us the heart of this glorious God. Pharaoh was presented to be this person who is absolutely opposed to God in every way. He wanted nothing to do with God. In chapter 5, he asks Moses, "Who is your God that I should obey him?" He was a religious pluralist living in Egypt, the greatest nation at the time. He looked around and he said, "Look, we got plenty of gods. What makes your God so special?" And here goes God responding to Pharaoh through these 10 plagues. He miraculously breaks his people out of Pharaoh's captivity, sets them free. When they get to the edge of the city, they're met with a column of cloud and a column of fire to lead them both day and night. God leads his people to actually graciously plunders the Egyptians, gives them everything they'll need for the journey. They're pressed between a sea and an opposing army. God is the one who actually sets his people free by leading them through the sea on dry ground. God has already freed his people. He's already saved them. Now he has them in the wilderness. This is the season of sanctification where he's shaping them up and making them into who they ought to be. And now God is going to take this saved and being sanctified people and he's going to give them a set of rules. He's going to give them a new way, a new kingdom way to live. This is what the Ten Commandments teach us, this constitution of what it looks like for God to be king and for people to live in this gracious kingdom. And how God does it is fascinating. God sets himself as the true and better king over Pharaoh and all the other kings of the world. We won't consider them all, but let's just look at a few of these together. Exodus chapter 20, verses 1 to 21, as all those words are on the screen here. This constitution is a declaration of God's goodness and the goodness of God's kingdom over the kingdoms of this world. Let's consider just 3 ways God's kingdom is a better kingdom than Pharaoh's kingdom and all the other kingdoms. In Pharaoh's kingdom, the powerful have complete control over others. People say, well, I'm God and I rule and other people do what I say. But in God's kingdom and in the first commandment, we see there's only one God, so no one's going to rule over another. There's just going to be different aspects of mediated authority that God will give people. And in this, we get a picture of our hearts. Look at the MRI scan. There it is. The base human compulsion to make the world revolve around you and revolve around me. I feel it. I have it. and we need a check. And the Ten Commandments comes along and it provides just that for us. Points out the kingdoms of this world, points out our own compulsions in our hearts, and God very graciously says, I'm the true king. So no one's going to rule and oppress other people. I'll be the true king. We see later on in the Ten Commandments, we see Pharaoh's kingdom, that family life is subject to destruction. Yeah, in the book of Exodus, it actually tells us about a full genocide that was released on the land. But look at this gracious, good kingdom that God is bringing. Commands 5 and 6 teach us that respect for the family, and there will be integrity for marriages, and life will be preserved at every possible point in God's kingdom. In Pharaoh's kingdom, our base compulsion to reject authority and to just have whatever we want, God comes in, he says, listen, there's a better way. And what God's doing here is God's actually letting us into the owner's manual of life. The Creator God is letting his people in on how they're created. And God's saying it's actually going to be best for you if you actually don't let yourself have everything you want. But that is the way in Pharaoh's kingdom. You just look around, says, well, I'll have her and I'll have that and I'll have these things in this way. And God comes along in Commandments 5 and 6 and he says, listen, there's a better way to live. And God orients us to it. We're called to honor authority in God's kingdom. God's kingdom combats all other kingdoms of this world by calling spouses to be devoted to one another, by calling children and parents to exist in a place of respect and honor and love and care for one another. And it's a devotion that leads to integrity over time. This is the kingdom that God's bringing. Well, finally, again, we're not looking at them all, but just one more to consider. In Pharaoh's kingdom, the weak have no effective legal protection, but look at the beauty of this kingdom that God is offering. The 9th commandment says there'll be an integrity and there will be no impartiality in the judicial system. Now, you might hear these and you might think, well, I don't know, these actually still feel sort of restrictive, don't they? But just consider, children need to know what the rules are. My son, Shepherd, he needs to know that just wandering around in the middle of the road is not allowed. That thing that could actually be fun for him, and he might actually just want to go out and just have a wander and a walk around, it could be the very thing that gets him killed by a car. Well, so it is with us. People created in the image of this God. We need this king to come along and tell us how we were created, tell us how life is supposed to be. Because the very things that feel like restrictions for us, they can actually be the very things that free us and liberate us. Consider this freeing and liberating God. He breaks a people out of captivity. He protects them. He provides for them. And then and only then does he then reveal a few rules for how this life of freedom ought to be. Wouldn't it be absurd if he actually went to people in captivity, gave them a list of things they ought to do, put them up to this task, just, hey, if you can obey 70% of what I tell you today, then I'll set you free. Not this God. This God sets a people free and then just gives them the way to stay free. Well, that's the second thing that I want to show you from the book of Exodus, specifically chapter 20, and just helping us see that the Ten Commandments, they aren't actually a form of bondage and oppression. They're actually the roadmap to freedom. It's that God's law leads to freedom and life. It leads to freedom and life. The Ten Commandments were given to a free and to a liberated people. They were given as God's guidance for people looking for a way to live. But most people misunderstand the Ten Commandments. They're seen as words given to a people to oppress a people or restrict a people. That's just not the way God intended it at all. So let's just think about how this actually functions in the world in a very practical sense. Well, think of a fish. Think of a fish. The fish isn't free when the fish is on land. The fish is free when the fish is in water. The fish was actually made for certain restraints and constraints on its life. Today, our modern popular culture, we like to think, well, that real freedom is actually being free of all different types of external constraints. Being free is being free to be whoever I want to be or do whatever I want to do. But just consider, that fish, when you set it on land and tell that fish to be its true self, that fish is dead in a matter of time. And so it is with you and me. See, our lives are full of very practical things that might feel constraining for us, but they are actually life to us. When you wake up in the morning and your alarm clock is telling you to get out of your warm and cozy bed, well, that doesn't feel good either, but we know that's good for us. when we're in the gym and we're pushing our bodies beyond what they can physically bear, when you're on the bike or you're having a jog and you're pushing your heart beyond its comfortable limits. In those moments, your body's telling you to stop. Your body's saying, this is uncomfortable. This is restraining to me. And keeping ourselves there and pushing ourselves in that space over time, it is actually life to us. And so it is with God's law. It might look restrictive. At times it might feel like it's constraining. But so it is. It's the very way to set the soul free. And it does it in a very unexpected way. The third truth that we see from the Ten Commandments is that God demands perfection, and God so graciously provides that very perfection that He demands. We don't always desire marital fidelity. We don't always not covet after our neighbor, people's stuff. Your neighbor gets a new car delivered on the block. You find news of other people moving house to somewhere better, and something goes off inside of us. And the Ten Commandments help us see the different compulsions that we have inside of us, how we're not as good as we'd like to admit that we are. The Ten Commandments are a roadmap to freedom, and it's a roadmap leading us to Jesus. Because the longer we spend in the commandments, these commandments show us that in our hearts, we're all functional atheists. We might be able to pass an exam and get some of this right, but at a heart level, we actually don't love God, and we don't love one another. And all the law can really do is to reveal this out for us. It can show us that we don't have a righteous record, and it can show us that we don't have right desires, but it can't do anything beyond that. The law is intended to get us to Jesus. It is a roadmap to freedom, and it's going to take us all the way to Him. We see in Galatians chapter 3, verses 21 and 24, that the law was a tutor to bring us to Christ, that we might be justified by faith. For if there had been a law given which could have given life, truly righteousness would have been born out of the law. Only Jesus can give us the right record before God. And as we meditate on the right record that He gives us by faith alone, well, then we have a right desire springing up from that as well. This brings us to that point when we have to consider maybe the reason that some of our lives are coming unraveled is that we are being little pharaohs trying to run our own little kingdoms. God's been trying to break free to some of us. He's been trying to get through to some of us. And yeah, well, He might have not sent a plague of boils that takes over the whole body. Maybe it's actually our health that is slowly and surely deteriorating, and we're wishing things were different. Maybe God hasn't actually taken your firstborn, but what you have found in this last season is that your relationships are gradually coming undone and falling apart. Could it actually be that God, in His mercy, is actually reaching out to us and trying to wake us up and even save us from something much worse than a few bits of our lives deteriorating and falling apart? Well, it's something we have to consider, because Moses, looking back on this moment and the giving of this law, the giving of God's law, he says to his people, see, I put before you today life and blessings, or death and curses. And he tells us, choose life. Here we are considering the Ten Commandments, this roadmap to freedom, this roadmap to Jesus Himself, who graciously goes to the cross and He takes the place of people like me, of people like you, that have failed at every one of these commandments. And He says, you know what? God does demand perfection. He does demand perfect record keeping here. And He says, you know what? I'm going to go do that for you. He lived a perfect life. He went to the cross. Died in the place of guilty sinners. And He just has this simple invitation: come to me. Come to me. Come to me. And taken in this way, we see the Ten Commandments. They're actually not these oppressive rules to weigh us down, but they're actually an expression of this King's beautiful heart. It's an MRI of our own souls. And they get us to the place where we can hear Jesus' invitation to come to Him.